The illusion of glory in a fractured system. A phantom existence born from absolute sacrifice. A slow heartbeat echoes in the heavy dark. 94% will fail the selection protocol. The first lesson is not survival. It is the willing termination of your legal existence. They strip away your past. You become a nameless function in a brutal, unending equation. Signing the waiver removes you from the grid. A ghost born in the cold ink. There is no return ticket. The physical self is erased, leaving only the tactical asset. Identity is a liability. The unit demands an empty vessel, optimized for the coming storm. Welcome to the proving grounds. The brutal reality of Tier 1 selection begins right now. Every muscle screams against the elements. The mind forcibly overrides the failing biological structure. The environment offers no mercy. Weakness is instantly penalized by the cold, jagged steel. The cadre hunts for structural failure. They apply maximum pressure until the mental foundation shatters. Another asset drops out of the equation. The 94% attrition rate claims its toll. Empathy is a tactical error. You step over the fallen and maintain the forward momentum. The earth attempts to consume you. Only sheer mechanical inertia keeps the boots moving forward. Oxygen becomes a luxury. The freezing depths test the final limits of your biological endurance. Surviving the cold requires mental isolation. You detach from the suffering to remain completely operational. Time is the ultimate enemy. Every ticking second measures the distance between failure and selection. The physical torment pauses, but the psychological conditioning has only just breached the surface layer. You survive the crucible. The 94% are gone, leaving only the hollowed-out elite assets. The proving grounds fade to black. The ghost is fully formed, ready for the next deployment. The architecture of violence. A new operational theater built upon shifting sands and absolute aggression. The freezing mud is replaced by the desert heat. The mission shifts to direct kinetic action. The structural integrity is calculated. Explosive forces are primed to violently rewrite the physical boundaries. A silent, lethal countdown begins. The quiet before the devastating overpressure completely shatters the atmosphere. You brace for the kinetic impact. The violent compression of the atmosphere is totally inescapable. The sudden shockwave severely compresses the spine. Biological structures violently vibrate against the acoustic trauma. You step directly into the chaos. The breached threshold is aggressively crossed with calculated momentum. The tool demands absolute precision. There is zero margin for human hesitation or operational error. The trigger breaks smoothly. The hostile element is instantly neutralized in a fraction of a heartbeat. The target becomes a cold statue. Another kinetic problem permanently removed from the active equation. There is absolutely no hatred involved. The aggressive action is purely a cold mechanical necessity. The brass violently falls away. Each empty shell represents a permanent, irreversible tactical decision. The clearing process is entirely systematic. Every dark corner holds a potential, sudden, structural failure. The team operates as a single machine, isolated gears turning in a violent, synchronized rhythm. The second threat is sent offline. The mechanical loop of identification and neutralization relentlessly continues. The hostile architecture is violently dismantled. Only the cold, static remnants of the encounter remain. The violent kinetic burst concludes. The biological system heavily struggles to process the sudden drop. The lenses mechanically filter the horror. The surrounding world is reduced to cold, unfeeling green. The primary objective is completely secured. But the hidden psychological toll begins to heavily accumulate. The extraction protocol successfully initiates. You leave the dead zone and return to the void. The deafening silence of a shattered sanctuary. The chaotic war zone rapidly shifts to the empty living room. 6 months of kinetic violence officially ends. The forced return to civilian space brings absolute, suffocating isolation. The physical structure returns completely intact. The psychological foundation is severely fractured beyond any recognizable repair. The civilian entity manually closed the final door. The emotional anchor is permanently severed and forced offline. The complete lack of an active threat is terrifying. The biological system forcefully demands the familiar chaos. The perimeter is totally clear. Only the cold remnants of a past life aggressively remain in the dark. You clear the empty rooms repeatedly. A desperate mechanical attempt to regain total environmental control. Time loses all tactical meaning. The endless hours forcefully stretch into a suffocating, deeply hollow void. The hands remember the violent recoil. Holding a fragile glass feels entirely foreign and deeply unnatural. The invisible ghosts of the desert actively follow you. The silent apartment slowly becomes a hostile zone. The acoustic trigger is entirely unexpected. The compromised biological structure immediately registers an incoming, devastating kinetic threat. The sudden flash severely disorients the mind. The damaged brain instantly reverts back to the kinetic protocol. The body violently drops. Survival instincts aggressively overwrite the safe, heavily insulated civilian reality entirely. You desperately seek heavy structural cover. The phantom overpressure severely compresses the hypervigilant nervous system. The kinetic strike never happens. You are aggressively bracing for a violent storm that simply does not exist. The violent illusion slowly fades away. The hostile architecture rapidly collapses back into a quiet apartment. The hands actively betray the command structure. The internal wire is permanently crossed and severely damaged. The external world moves forward blindly. The isolated asset remains violently trapped within the invisible loop. You forcefully stand back up. The invisible enemy within is the most devastating, unstoppable kinetic force. The personal casualty is entirely absolute. The operator is now a completely isolated, permanently untethered entity. The phantom war in the dead of night. Sleep becomes a deeply compromised, entirely hostile territory. The biological system violently demands rest. The hypervigilant mind aggressively rejects the entirely vulnerable state of sleep. Closing the eyes forcefully invites the ghosts. The cold statues violently return to the active operational grid. Chemical intervention is completely ineffective. The severe structural damage extends far beyond simple biological imbalances. The mirror violently reflects a stranger, a hollow shell completely optimized for extreme, devastating kinetic violence. The physical anchor is violently slipping. Reality heavily distorts into a completely fractured, deeply aggressive illusion. The sensory input violently fails to reset the system. The internal alarm continuously sounds an invisible threat. The acoustic pattern violently mimics the battlefield. The steady rhythm forcefully simulates rapidly approaching hostile elements. The perimeter must be absolutely secured. The civilian architecture feels entirely porous and deeply, irreversibly compromised. Visual access is aggressively denied. The tactical mind forcefully constructs a heavily shielded, entirely impenetrable bunker. Comfort is a deeply dangerous liability. The structural corner violently offers the only completely secure vantage point. The mechanical barrier is fully engaged, but the actual, devastating threat aggressively originates from entirely within. The hands desperately require kinetic action. Idle moments violently breed terrifying, entirely hostile, and destructive thoughts. Muscle memory forcefully overrides logical thought. You are permanently wired for rapid, completely unfeeling disassembly and reconstruction. Every mundane object forcefully becomes a weapon. The hypervigilant state violently rejects any concept of absolute peace. The daily routine violently stagnates. The civilian world forcefully operates on a completely meaningless, heavily muted frequency. The mechanical distraction forcefully fails. The crushing, entirely overwhelming absolute isolation violently returns to the active grid. Operational coherence is severely degrading. The entirely isolated tactical asset is forcefully going totally offline. The perimeter walk is violently endless. You are actively patrolling an entirely dead, completely meaningless civilian zone. The completely broken machine forcefully waits. The profound silence violently demands an entirely new, destructive directive. The invisible gravity of a fractured mind. The domestic space heavily collapses into an active combat zone. The gear is completely useless here. Yet the hands violently demand the familiar weight of the tactical nylon. The mechanical tool offers absolute predictability. It is the only physical structure that remains entirely loyal. Carbon and steel violently replace human connection. The mechanical components forcefully offer a deeply cold sanctuary. Every metallic click is a violent anchor, a desperate attempt to forcefully control the aggressively degrading environment. The deeply fractured mind aggressively manufactures threats. The civilian architecture violently morphs into a hostile breach point. The hostile elements are entirely fabricated. The most devastating kinetic strike originates from completely within. The tactical asset violently rejects the reality. The biological system forcefully spirals into a deeply chaotic freefall. The kinetic tool is forcefully discarded. but the deeply ingrained violent programming completely refuses to shut down. The completely isolated asset desperately seeks structural stability. The surrounding environment heavily spins into absolute, unfeeling chaos. The physical form violently purges the heavy silence. The profoundly twisted biology desperately demands the kinetic overpressure. The cold violently shocks the failing system. The severely fractured reflection entirely confirms the absolute, irreversible damage. The singular identity is violently shattered. Only the completely fractured remnants of a tactical ghost remain entirely. The entirely empty rooms severely suffocate the mind. The profound isolation forcefully acts as a kinetic strangulation. The civilian connection is entirely terminated. The deeply irreversible signature violently confirms the absolute, completely permanent erasure. The body violently braces for the incoming shockwave. The completely phantom overpressure severely compresses the deeply damaged spine. The auditory trauma is completely permanent. The deeply devastating kinetic blasts violently echo in the entirely silent room. The mechanical rhythm forcefully attempts stabilization. The severely damaged biological structure is entirely spiraling, violently out of control. The absolute silence is violently breached. The completely unexpected mechanical signal aggressively pierces the deeply suffocating isolation entirely. The tactical asset is forcefully reactivated. The completely distant signal violently triggers the heavily ingrained operational loop entirely. The inevitable pull of the machine, the entirely safe civilian simulation forcefully and violently ends. The structural collapse is forcefully reversed. The tactical programming violently reclaims total control of the failing system. The secure network actively demands a violent response. The entirely isolated ghost is forcefully summoned back online. The highly encrypted coordinates arrive in absolute silence. The next violent operational theater is heavily established completely. The operational trace is violently erased entirely. The transition protocol forcefully initiates without any human hesitation whatsoever. The entirely fake civilian sanctuary is permanently abandoned. The domestic illusion violently collapses into entirely unfeeling dust. The mechanical preparations forcefully suppress the completely fractured mind. The entirely lethal tools provide a secure bunker. The heavy ceramic armor violently shields the failing biological core, a completely rigid shell for an entirely empty vessel. The severe physical burden is actively forcefully welcomed. The crushing weight violently anchors the entirely drifting psychological state. The kinetic instrument is fully completely heavily primed. The entirely mechanical extension of the operator is entirely brought online. The mechanical transformation is absolutely violently entirely complete. The completely vulnerable civilian entity is entirely, permanently, forcefully, completely erased. The entirely violent footsteps forcefully, completely resume. The entirely inevitable violent march back into the heavy kinetic storm heavily begins. The total operational weight is heavily, completely, actively accepted. The entirely damaged biological structure forcefully, violently prepares for absolute impact. The domestic past is completely, forcefully, violently severed. The entirely tactical ghost aggressively, actively leaves absolutely zero emotional trace entirely. The final threshold is forcefully, violently, heavily, entirely approached. The entirely mechanical barrier between the absolute void and active conflict. The internal mechanical lock is completely, violently, absolutely disengaged. The completely sterile, entirely safe, domestic simulation forcefully, violently, permanently, actively, completely ends. The deeply cold environment completely, aggressively, forcefully, heavily welcomes the tactical asset. The completely, entirely dark void violently, completely, forcefully, actively returns. The active deployment protocol is violently, completely, forcefully, entirely, heavily initialized. The entirely civilian sector is permanently, heavily, forcefully, completely, actively abandoned. The heavily tactical extraction entirely, violently, completely, forcefully, entirely arrives. The completely, entirely unfeeling machine aggressively, heavily, violently, forcefully demands its completely isolated operator. The fractured ghost is violently, entirely, forcefully, completely, actively, heavily, totally absorbed. The completely, entirely broken, violently mechanical loop forcefully, completely, entirely, violently, relentlessly continues. The endless architecture of the loop. A permanent, violently enforced exile from the entire civilian world. The steel cage aggressively vibrates. The physical form is securely, entirely forcefully transported back to the void. The machine violently shifts forward. Every mechanical rotation forcefully, entirely aggressively, increases the distance from human connection. The cold road is aggressively devoured. There is absolutely no mechanism for reversing the entire tactical momentum. The tactical equipment completely demands total structural perfection. The biological components are entirely secondary to the gear. The civilian simulation is forcefully, violently purged. The operating system actively reboots into entirely pure kinetic readiness. The kinetic transit entirely aggressively concludes. The completely isolated ghost forcefully arrives at the sterile departure threshold. The sterile lights actively, aggressively eliminate the shadows. The cold architecture violently demands absolute, entirely tactical compliance. The concrete entirely violently strikes back. The physical form aggressively anchors into the entirely unfeeling tactical environment. The kinetic supplies are aggressively transferred. The completely violent mathematics of the coming deployment are forcefully calculated. The heavy payload is forcefully completely acquired. The deadly mechanical tools violently replace any remaining biological emotion. The brass violently entirely waits for activation. A completely dormant, deeply aggressive storm of absolute kinetic energy. The tactical weight violently increases. The entirely aggressive burden completely heavily anchors the deeply fractured operational ghost. The tactical unit entirely aggressively reassembles. The isolated gears violently synchronize for the deeply entirely incoming kinetic strike. The entirely isolated shadow forcefully completely violently rejoins the mechanical collective. Individual identity is entirely, permanently, violently erased. The kinetic instrument is violently, entirely forcefully secured. The mechanical loop heavily demands complete, entirely flawless operational perfection. The entirely violent extraction machine heavily forcefully awakens. The completely unfeeling engine aggressively demands the absolute immediate departure. Visual input is heavily, aggressively, forcefully restricted. The deeply fractured, completely, entirely broken mind violently, entirely forcefully detaches. The forward momentum is entirely, aggressively, forcefully, violently reinitiated. The entirely deeply silent, violently, completely forceful kinetic command. The active violently, completely, entirely, heavily operational void, completely, forcefully, entirely, aggressively, heavily, actively, absolutely, entirely swallows the ghost. The infinite kinetic cycle. The heavily armored ghost violently returns to the eternal, deeply unforgiving storm. The physical anchor is violently locked in. The entirely fractured biological structure braces for sudden atmospheric compression. The lethal instrument remains completely dormant. A heavy, violent pause before the entirely devastating kinetic engagement resumes. The atmospheric elevation violently forcefully increases. The entirely heavy tactical machine completely aggressively separates from the static ground. The final heavy armor is violently secured. The completely, entirely isolated entity forcefully prepares to heavily penetrate the airspace. The operational timeline is violently aggressively compressed. The entirely, completely approaching breach point forcefully, heavily demands absolute mechanical perfection. The completely optical sensors violently actively wait for activation. The completely heavy darkness will forcefully, heavily, aggressively surrender. The entirely first round is completely violently chambered. The heavy kinetic payload is forcefully aggressively readied for entirely immediate delivery. The cold ghosts of the completely entirely previous loop violently, forcefully, entirely return. The deeply fractured psychology violently collapses. The entirely violent hallucinations are heavily, forcefully, completely suppressed. The deeply entirely isolated ghost entirely violently aggressively reclaims operational reality. The completely absolute threshold is completely violently open. The entirely heavily hostile void violently aggressively, heavily, forcefully, entirely demands tribute. The completely heavily secure network entirely violently forcefully engages. The completely isolated gears entirely aggressively, violently, forcefully, entirely perfectly sync. The entirely mechanical lifeline is completely violently, entirely secured. The entirely completely heavily fractured biological entity violently completely trusts the nylon. The completely entirely total operational weight is heavily completely violently borne. The completely unfeeling ghost heavily stands at the edge. The entirely violent optical signal entirely aggressively, heavily, entirely, completely violently shifts. The completely deeply entirely heavy kinetic drop is imminent. The completely deeply suffocating void entirely, completely, violently, heavily, entirely, forcefully, actively, completely demands, completely, entirely heavy, completely, entirely irreversible submission. The entirely physical form, violently, aggressively, completely heavily, entirely plummets. The completely heavily aggressive, entirely endless tactical loop forcefully restarts. The heavily violently completely aggressive, entirely completely descent, entirely completely forcefully continues. The completely deeply violently, entirely isolated ghost is entirely erased. The violently, completely, entirely, completely, aggressive, tactical, entirely, heavily, entirely, completely, loop is entirely, heavily, forcefully, entirely, completely, entirely, closed. The entirely, ghost vanishes. Want to entirely, completely, heavily, directly know what they entirely violently sacrifice to? Entirely survive the entirely? Next, completely violent loop? Subscribe entirely now.